8:30 in the morning. Yep. Now, for the record, this is the recording of the WebRTC working group at TPAC. First day. Meeting schedule. We went over that a little earlier, but showing it again. We have a coffee break at 10. So we'll be talking for 1.5 hours and then we have a break. That's probably the most important thing to know. And tomorrow's meeting starts again at 8:30. And after lunch tomorrow, we have a few slots that are additional slots, which means that if we have to cut the discussion short because we ran out of time today, we can reschedule some for the morning, for tomorrow. That might turn out to be an advantage. So by 5:30 tomorrow, we're supposed to be done. We should know what the resolution is of all the issues we have discussed. We should know how to progress on all the ideas that have been presented for future work. And we should hit the ground running. And then comes the hard work before the next meeting. So, slideware, state of the working group. That's me talking. By the way, I'm still Harald Aldestrand. I'm chairing this working group together with Bernard, who couldn't be here. As you can see from the meeting screen at the bottom, he's carefully listening and will tell me if I'm completely misrepresenting what's going on. We've been doing this stuff for 7 years now. So we're 7 years into a 2-year project. It's time to get finished. So we're chartered. We have a charter that says we're going to finish WebRTC 1.0 with high priority. We're going to find an object-oriented API based on ORTC. I'm paraphrasing the charter. We're going to describe requirements for new use cases, and we're going to address them. And what we think we need for those new use cases are some new protocols, new data access functions, some of which are in proposals that will be before you before the end of this meeting, and probably some that are not. The environment I'm reading out of the room is that people demand that WebRTC 1.0 should just work. Run the same program in 2 browsers and get the same results. As you know, that's actually true for some simple cases. But as of end of last week, we have tried to make it a little bit more true by switching on Unified Plan SDP in Chrome Canary, which immediately broke 1/3 of the users. So it's not quite there yet, but we're getting closer. We're getting closer. We think that the market, as in the users and the browser vendors, demand that we should be given low-level access to data, which will be a recurring theme in the what do we do next talks this afternoon and tomorrow morning. And we think that the market demands that either they're given up or they're shouting less loudly than they used to, and control surfaces that allow them to stop using SDP.
Is this a time for debate? Hello.
Our comments.
Let's you got presentations to
Okay,
show.
okay.
Oh, yeah. I mean, one reason I'm not hearing that so loudly anymore might be because they've given up yelling at me because nothing happens anyway. So the core specs, media capture and streams, WebRTC 1.0. Media capture streams as a candidate recommendation has been stable for a year. No, it hasn't. It's just that we haven't bothered publishing a candidate recommendation for a year. We got 20 open issues, of which more than half are more than 3 months old. We have an interoperability matrix that's pretty good, relatively speaking. We have promised to be at proposed recommendation in this quarter. WebRTC 1.0, we renewed the candidate recommendation when we separated the identity spec. There are 46 open issues, of which 31 are older than 3 months. That's also not good. The interoperability matrix shows a lot of issues. And we have a Confluence map that shows implementation progress. The community senses that this is still a work in progress. In order to figure out if anything worked with WebRTC 1.0, you have to test it in the browsers you're interested in. And we have promised to have the proposed recommendation 1 year from now. Identity got separated into its own recommendation. It's got 23 open issues, which is 22 older than 3 months, which is absolutely not good. We have not separated the test suite for the identity from the test suite from the main spec. We should be doing that. So I can't say anything about the status there. And again, we have promised that it will be a proposed recommendation a year from now. Community senses that we seem to be a bit slow there. Resources available. We have 2 editors. We want to take a moment to thank very much the editors who had left the editors team, not for leaving, but for everything they contributed while they were there, especially Dan, Taylor, and Adam. Of which only Dan is here. Dan, thank you. And there are other drafts that are managed by other editors. One reminder when we're thinking about what we should do first and next is that there is no us, there's only us. As in, resources come from people being motivated to do things with things they care about. And organizations sponsor people to work on this based on what they care about. So it's a gift economy. If you want to have something happen, give. And we need to make sure we get things done, both with finishing specs and with getting new stuff done, because otherwise people do things, but they don't do this together with us. And lack of cooperation means lack of cooperation. Number of other documents: screen share, recorder, stats. Yep, we're working on it. There's a few documents that have been very, very quiet, but we shouldn't forget them, because forgotten documents come back to bite you. This is the media capture depth document that I haven't seen anyone complaining about for a year or 2 years. There's all the output devices, which I think is mostly not talked about because nobody wants to change it anymore. There's content hints. There are a couple of minor open issues, but we released the code in Chrome and it's actually used by someone. Not very many people, but someone. And DSCP, which was deemed important at the time, but seems to have quietened down. I mean, working groups should have a decision either killing or advancing documents. These are all stuff that is dependent on the core draft, so it doesn't make sense to try to advance them beyond CR. But we shouldn't forget.
Is Media Recorder API in scope, or it's not listed there?
It's our group. It's on that
okay.
Second bullet on that slide.
Okay, cool.
So there's attention focus for this group, this meeting. Finish 1.0. Any bug that's worth talking about in a group should be presented. If we manage to get a presenter, we're brutally deleting everything from the agenda that we didn't get anyone to shepherd. We're looking at new APIs and we want to attend to raw media so that we know which direction we recommend going. We're not going to finish much of that this meeting because things don't finish in meetings, but we should get some decisions made. So that's everything I want to say about status of group. And now we can take 5 minutes for comments on discussion on that before we switch to the next part of the session. Anyone?
Just a comment that I really like the first bullet, finish 1.0, get all the bugs resolved. That's really the high priority for me, and I believe a lot of the community.
Yeah, hi, I'm Janivar. I agree with that.
Yes, please contribute. Media capture and outputs. Or media capture and streams is what I like to call it. But and audio output. So we got 3 issues that we want to discuss here. And Janivar, do you want to go to issue 532?
Yes, thank you. All right, so we have some old language in the spec there. And in 2016, we had our solution to iframes was to add this language that for the origin, they were supposed to present a permission request to the user from. It basically said, take the origin of the top level browsing context and combine it with the iframes origin. And the purpose there was really that it's best explained with an example that I'm showing here. Like if the top level is New York Times, they might outsource their tech support chat. Let's say they had a tech support chat, doesn't matter.
By the way, we have administrative interrupts. I always forget. Do we have a scribe? Okay, Dom is scribing. Thank you.
All right, cool. So they want to outsource WebRTC in an iframe. Right now in browsers, when they request GUM, you'll get a permission request that says the URL of this sub iframe wants to request permission. And at the time in 2016, we thought it was important that permission only be granted in this specific context, this combination, so that neither New York Times nor techsupport.fr, in this case, example, would get permission if you were to visit their individual sites. So this has sort of been overtaken by feature policy, where there's an allow attribute on an iframe. And a part of the thinking behind feature policy is that users don't understand iframes. So it's better to have a different model where that allows you to make new permission models where you grant to the top level domain, the one that the user understands. And then that domain can, if it wants to, delegate permissions to iframes that it wants. And the key there being that permission is off by default. So, and this is good because it means that our combined language is now redundant and can be removed. So the conclusion is that we can remove the combined language once this PR5 or 6 has been merged. So I should mention that with feature policy, we'll be able to implement in browsers permission prompts that are simpler, which is shown in the second slide, where you're effectively granting permission to the top level domain. And none of the browsers do this yet, but this would be possible for browsers to do at this point, which is closer to what we feel users would understand. Now, we don't have to do that, and it is more than having a model that makes sense.
Actually, I think Chrome has been doing this model for a couple of years, just disobeying the specs.
Well, yes, but I don't think the specs actually cover what the prompts have to cover, what they have to contain.
Oh, it's one reason why the specs are unclear on the point. We couldn't agree.
Right. Well, but there's no, I mean, we can have feature policy and this restriction mechanism that sort of can exist separate from our decision of what we want to do with the prompts, because it might make sense. Some browsers might want to be more techie and say, this is the actual iframe that's asking. So formulating the UX is sort of not our area. But it's important to mention that Chrome has supported the iframe allow attribute for some time, and Firefox 64 still has it behind the pref, and we hope to ship it soon.
Safari is basically doing that. We are using the allow attribute, and basically the prompt is only showing the top level origin. And
Perfect. All right.
We think for users it's the most complex thing we can provide.
Right.
So we're fine with this approach.
That's great. Yeah, I need to upgrade my OS X so I get to try the latest Safari.
Sounds like everyone's shouting yes.
Yes.
Not great. No question? No. Oh, yeah, so slide 2 shows the language that gets removed. And there was I had the second slide here because there was sort of a question here, which is that, and I'm showing the green text that got added to the permission spec that allows us to do that in case someone wants to go looking for that. But the interesting part was that the origin in media capture was actually never used by the request permission to use algorithm. So the question then is for the sentence that it says, we remove the part that says for the origin identified by origin identifier, request permission. And now it won't say that anymore. So the question there, is that good riddance, or was there an intent here to dictate something about scope of UX?
I think good riddance is the right answer, no matter what the question was.
All right, great. I guess my question was, should the spec say anything about permission UX? But it sounds like we're good.
$540.
All right, so this is a question if get user media should be functional in secured context only. Get user media has been around for a while, and I think most browsers only implement it in HTTPS. Firefox, I think, is the lone browser that still supports HTTP, but we're also happy to switch to only HTTPS. The remaining question is that browsers currently, if you go to HTTP, they'll still see the get user media method. They can call it, and it will fail. It will reject with not supported error. Sorry, not allowed error. I'm not sure. Some browsers might differ there. But anyway, so the question here, the proposal is to limit get user media to secure context only. And this would go a step further, which would mean that in HTTP, you wouldn't even see the method on the interface. So you would get, so if you were to do get user media in Navigator media devices, that would be false in HTTP. Or we could go a step further and remove the media devices object on Navigator itself. In that case, you know, doing a console log media devices in Navigator would be false. So those are two choices. And I mentioned a second line here, which is that if we go with the second choice, the first choice will actually type error. So we should just pick one. And I think the argument for getting rid of the media devices object itself is that none of the other methods there make any sense absent get user media. The only question there is you might have some reason to enumerate devices. Enumerates not only input devices like camera and microphone, but also output speaker devices, which is used by setSync ID, which is the next slide. And on-device change as well also hangs off of media devices. So I didn't think of this when I wrote the slides, but it might make sense to then look at the next slide at the same time, which is the same proposal for setSync ID on HTML media element. Because they kind of go together now because of enumerate devices. So if we can go back to the first slide. So that's pretty much what we should decide. Should we remove only the method or the entire media devices object in HTTP?
Do you have any numbers on the usage?
Unfortunately, no. I think the question here is more of scoping, and that do we consider these methods as a combined interface or as individual methods? And does anyone have any use cases for using either of these in HTTP?
My guess is that we should get rid of the object in its entirety. I mean, the move is to, you know, not expose as little as possible in HTTP. Enumerate device is a source of fingerprinting, so my personal sense is that we should remove the whole.
Yeah, we agree too. The only potential issue is breaking some apps, but I hope it's a little there, and the gain is important. So would be willing to make media devices secure context.
Do we normally just remove the interface that's not visible in the, it's not in Navigator, or do you normally throw an exception?
Well, this is the functionality of the secure context keyword in WebIDL, so I think the answer is yes.
I think it's consistent with other APIs, other web APIs as well.
Right.
So
Okay.
Yeah.
So when we started out on this adventure, I think secure context actually didn't exist. So
Right.
we're adopting features as we go along.
Yeah, and I agree as well that I think it makes sense to remove the media devices object.
I mean, I think the point is that we've been asking people to only use HTTPS for get user media for quite some time. So this would be very consistent with direction, and particularly for things like screen sharing, it is completely scary to imagine that being used with HTTP.
Localhost is a secure context. Sometimes I'm scared by that, but it is.
yeah, or the browser can actually provide in the developer menu a way to toggle this off and on, for instance.
I guess there's a second question here for slide 2, which is for setSync ID on the media element. Do we want to do the same thing now that enumerate devices will be gone? Or is there more compatibility risk here? I don't think so, because not all browsers support it.
So who is defining setSync ID? Is it this group or? Okay.
Yeah.
So you can't use set sync ID if you can't enumerate the devices, right? So
Well, where would you get the ID from?
right.
Right.
So to me, yes, it should be removed.
What's the ID? Is it the track ID or?
It's
Device.
the ID that comes from enumerate devices.
Oh, okay, yeah.
There's no specific values like
Right.
null, undefined, empty string, whatever.
Well, empty string means the default output of the system, which is
Okay.
what it is already.
So there's a usual removal process, but I think, speaking with my chair hat on, it seems that the group seems to have consensus to remove. That is to strap secure context as high as possible in the food chain.
I think so. And there's also a question between set sync ID of the method and sync ID of the attributes, which is. So I could see some sites breaking because they enumerate all attributes out of some consistency reason. But I mean, if the attribute's missing, it would just be undefined anyway.
We have the usual progress for deprecation, which has all these warnings and counters and all that. So yeah, I think normal process for removal.
Great.
Okay, decision recorded. Secure context for everything. Now over to screen capture. This is possibly the hottest spec in the suite at the moment. And as someone said, it's got scary bits in it.
Lots of issues.
So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 issues on this slide, and yeah, it's going to take a while. Let's get started. Henrik.
Right. So a lot of things haven't been defined yet. One of the issues that's been open for a long time is what do we do with full screen mode. And it's a bit tricky because there's different, what's full screen? Like an application might just do spawn a new window and go full screen, or it might have the existing window and make that full screen, or it might do like a borderless full screen that's not actually full screen. So there's cases where you might not get the expected result. The concern of this issue was if you're doing something like PowerPoint and you start full screen mode, the full screen will be a new window. So you'll just keep sharing like the presentation notes, which wouldn't be good. Problem is there's no way for us to tell like what's the intent. If an application spawns a new window, it's a new window. So just to make it define what we want to do and what we can do is the proposal is that if the window that you're sharing enters full screen mode, then the track is simply resized. You don't need to change any setting, and you don't want to change the sharing mode because it's the window you're sharing. You don't want to switch to and risk leaking other information. So you're still just sharing that window. But if the window, if a new window is spawned and you're sharing not that window, then we must not share the new window. And if it does go into full screen mode, the track or the existing window that you are sharing, it may become inaccessible depending on context. And there's other part of the spec saying if a window is inaccessible, it might be muted. So that is if you're sharing window. If you're sharing an application and you're aggregating windows, I don't think we'll have a problem with full screen mode because then that's covered. So that's the proposal. A concern could be that some applications won't work, but there's not much we can do about that. There is a related issue where I want to propose that we allow the user agent to switch which window you're sharing with the user gesture. That could be a workaround. But for now, yeah, any thoughts?
So this is just about clarification, right? There's
Yeah.
no change of behavior.
Yeah, no, it's just undefined what to do. So this is just clarifying.
So for the OS knowledgeable people, is the OS level concept of a window entering full screen in all operating systems, or is this OS dependent, whether the concept exists or not?
As far as I know, it's completely OS dependent. There's nothing on Mac OS or iOS as far as I know.
There's nothing that says that window enters full screen?
No.
No, it's always a new window in OS, Mac OS.
It's up to the application.
I think the thing that matters here is that there's no surprise to the end user. So that I think browsers, if they want to support, I think it's within the spec for browsers to support sort of smart sources that can handle this. And I think what it comes down to is whether the user receives this as the same application or not. And that's what we don't want to violate. We don't want to violate, of course, any surprises. Like with PowerPoint, if you have reader's notes that are visible in one mode, that would be the extreme case, I guess. But when you go full screen, they're not visible. That might cause concern if you didn't intend for your notes to be public, that kind of stuff. So it's a difficult area.
I would also note that in PowerPoint, you're using multiple displays. So you can actually select a display that will be used to show the slides, and that would solve it as well. So I think there's confusion about what goes on, but there's two things happening at once.
I think as long as the user agent is clear to the user what they are actually sharing, it's fine.
I think so.
So should we just treat it as a resize and clarify?
So what I'm hearing is that we have trouble finding the case where a window gets resized to full screen, because there's no such OS level concept, and full screen is actually ill-defined too. So I mean, at the moment I'm presenting full screen, except that I have another screen with different stuff on it. So it seems that not surprising the user is the key thing.
Yeah, I agree with Harold. If there's no concept of full screen, if it's very difficult to define the concept of full screen in an OS, how will you do that in the spec? So, I don't know. I'm fine with notes saying, hey, there's this thing about full screen, and then you can do track resizing. But we must not share it if sharing window and new full screen window is spawned. This is by definition, it's a new window. So why saying it's a must? Why saying it's a new full screen window? Because then what about the new window is spawned? Why is it full screen special there?
Right, it should already be covered.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, you're just saying that you should only share the window that's selected. I think that's obvious.
Yeah.
Not some other window.
Well,
So I'm hearing that there's a good reason to avoid normative text about this, but informative notes about the situation
Right.
should be there.
so as long as the user perceives it as the same surface, I think we're okay.
The thing with screencast is that you usually hook into the operating system without asking application, and
Right.
what the user perceives is application dependent.
But I think it would be a mistake to have normative spec language that ties the vendor's hands in order to do what users expect.
Okay. So add advice, don't add normatives. That seems to be the conclusion there. And now to figure out which window my cursor is in. Now I'm in the right window. Jan-Ivar.
Yes, so there's a big PR here waiting to get merged that will define behavior in detail of the existing constraints with get display media. And since no one reads PRs, I figured I might as well post all the text here. So to weed out any questions people might have. I don't know how in detail I should read this, but basically it's a table that follows the same constrainable properties pattern you'll find in get user media that lists the properties that apply to video display surfaces. I don't cover audio display surfaces yet. That would be a separate PR. And I basically outline, I follow the same model that GUM uses, which is define, constraints get complicated because there's like 3 dictionaries. It started out, the history there is that there used to be a single constraints dictionary that was too complicated, and we split it up to cover constraints. They have a different form when they're a constraint versus when they're a capability versus when they're a setting. And in short, a setting is the simplest one. That's only the data. So for width, that would be like a ulong. A capability would be a ulong range, like a min and a max for width. And a constraint would be either of those, because you can you can constrain by range, or you can constrain by this value only, which would be min and max equals the same thing, exact, or an ideal value or just a number. So it goes through and defines. So I followed GUM here, where sometimes it just describes the capability, and then you figure out, if you know the min and the max, you also know what values are valid within that range, and also what min and max would throw over constraint error on. So this one says that for width, as a capability, max must reflect the display surface's width, and min must reflect the width of the smallest aspect-preserving representation available through downscaling by the user agent. And then the same for height. Do we want to have questions or if anyone has any questions, just interrupt and I'll go through it.
Yeah, what does that mean? And downscaling because of what?
These are mostly written as descriptions. It's a little unclear sometimes with this whether the audience is a user of the API or the implementer, but this is sort of, sometimes our spec is written in between. So what it means is that since max is the width of the source, basically, that means you cannot upscale.
Mm-hmm.
And min means that the job of a capability is to return the full range of values that you can expect to see and be able to use. And the smallest one would be, so the implication here, which is covered later in the slide, is that we always preserve aspect with get display media, and the user is allowed to downscale as far as it is capable of downscaling.
So it's saying you must not upscale, and if you downscale, you must preserve aspect ratio.
Yes. If there are no questions on that, I'll keep on going and just interrupt. So for frame rate, that's why it also says, because of the 3 different data types, that's why it describes the plain number and also when it's a range. And the same thing here, a capability max must reflect the display surface's frame rate, and min must reflect the lowest frame rate available through frame decimation by the user agent. Next slide. The exact aspect ratio in width in pixels divided by height in pixels. This is the same language as in GUM, double rounded to 10th decimal place. And as a setting, here I describe it as a setting first because it's easier. You'll see why. As a setting represents width divided by height. This is the current, so basically describing it just as a combination of the same values I just described. As a capability, min and max must be the current setting value, rendering this property immutable from the application viewpoint. Basically saying, since all sources, available sources have the same there's no way the application can modify the aspect ratio. It means it's basically fixed, except if you're capturing a window and the end user resizes the window. In that case, the numbers will update. I'll get to that. Next one is Resize Mode. That's a constraint we added fairly late. That is either a value of none, meaning that the media track contains all the bits you would need to render the display in full detail, which if window device pixel ratio is greater than 1, which it would be on max Retina displays, means that width and height will be larger than the display's appearance from an end user viewpoint would suggest. You'll see this. I think here Firefox, if you do get display media, you get the full thing, which will actually render twice the size on a Mac than if you were to just put it in an unconstrained media element and play it. It would show up as twice the size as your desktop, versus Chrome does a downscale right now, so that it looks the right size. And the other value is crop and scale, which means that the media track contains an aspect representation of the display surface that has been downscaled by the user agent but not cropped, because you must not crop here. So this is also explained further down. And as a capability, the values none and crop and scale must be present, which means that user agents must support downscaling. Next slide. So the next slide. Any questions on this? Otherwise, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so these are less interesting. These are the existing constraints that existed in the spec. These are, as a setting indicates the type of display surface that's being captured. As a capability, the settings value must be the lone value present, rendering this property immutable from the application viewpoint. Again, these are effectively read-only constraints, if you will. A bit of a misnomer, but the same thing for logical surface, which is a Boolean, whether this is a true surface or a virtual one. And then there's the cursor constraint, which is not a readable only, which you can use to specify one of the cursor capture constraint values. Indicates if and when the cursor is included in the captured display surface. Next slide. So since an end user can resize a window that's being captured, some of the properties you observe through settings and capabilities may change. So this language is basically saying that when that happens, the user agent must queue a task to change those things all at once. And another effect of, so we inherit a lot of stuff from Get User Media that made sense for cameras and microphones that don't make so much sense for capturing screen. One of them is the whole over-constrained situation, which I don't believe any browser has implemented for microphone and camera either, but they make even less sense, if I could put it that way, for screens, I think. So basically what this says is if this causes an over-constrained situation, then the user agent must ignore the culprit constraints for as long as they over-constrain, and the user agent must not mute the track, and the user agent must not fire the over-constrained event. And there's a note that basically says that this spec already disallows min and exact constraints on the get display media function, where they produce a type error at the moment, because those are not needed. Basically, the only thing you should need in get display media is plain values, or basically ideal values, or the max constraint is also useful. And but at the same time, we do not, for spec reasons, it's trickier to override the track apply constraints method, which means that here they may produce over-constrained error or succeed depending on values. So basically, unless we further modify so that apply constraints will consistently throw type error as well, this is basically just spec language to say ignore min and exact constraints for apply constraints, never throw the over-constrained condition, and basically move on.
So this is I think this is a little bit underspecified, as I commented on the PR, that because it's not clear which resolution you're going to actually present to the user when
Right.
one of the constraints has been ignored.
Okay. It's in a specific case here, or I'm covering it in a slide later.
Good.
I think.
Okay, that's good.
Okay. So let's go to the next slide then. So there's a new section on downscaling. So for the purposes of the select settings algorithm, the user agent should consider all possible combinations of downscale dimensions that preserve the aspect ratio of the original display surface to the nearest pixel and frame rates available through frame decimation as available settings dictionaries. The downscaling and decimation effects of constraints is then effectively governed by the fitness distance algorithm. So this is basically saying that we already have a fitness distance algorithm to pick from all available sources. So this spec only has to define the range I mentioned earlier, from full size down to smallest available downscaled version. If these are settings dictionaries, we just define them as settings dictionaries, and then we invoke the fitness distance algorithm. So the intent behind that is for the user agent to produce output that is close to the ideal width and height and or ideal frame rate when these are specified, while at all times preserving the aspect ratio of the original display surface. And then I have some slides later on to describe what that would look like. The remaining language adds additional some requirements. And there was a question about what to do with retina displays. So this spec now says, well, this PR says the user agent should downscale by window device pixel ratio by default, unless otherwise directed by the applied constraints. So that if you don't say anything about constraints and we just do get display media of a retina screen, you would get the Chrome behavior right now, where it's downscaled to look. So if you were to render it unconstrained, it would have the size of your display that you're seeing, but not the detail. And if you want more than that, you can use constraints. You can interrogate the spec. You can interrogate the Resize Mode constraint to see whether it's crop and scale. That's one way to find out. You can get the capabilities and see that capabilities are larger than what you're getting back, that kind of thing. So that would allow people only people who want the full enchilada to get all the bits they need. And that's a should anyway. So, but then it says user agent must not crop the captured output, and user agent must not upscale the captured output or create additional frames. And the note talks about the use of the max constraint, because downscaling now is predominantly done by the ideal constraint and the constraint fitness algorithm. And it's useful, it might be useful to provide a max envelope in addition to that. And I'll show that on the next slide. So for those who want to copy down the URL, there's a live demo where I tried out basically mimic the fitness distance algorithm in JavaScript. And it allows you to click around. And it mostly stays within ideal. You click anywhere here. Click outside, there you go. Yeah, it's not a full canvas. So it mostly stays in there. There's some, if you make a square, that's the only time when it seems to go outside the ideal area. If you do a large square, more squares. That seems to behave better now. There's some edge cases there. If width and height are very similar, you can basically this goes through the whole algorithm and figures out the sizes with the smallest fitness distance. And you can get edge cases where there are multiple candidates that are very similar. That's the one where you got it to be bigger. And I'm not quite sure why that happens. But I believe I did another demo that I didn't include here where you can tell in these situations that there are multiple candidates and some of the other candidates are actually better. So I believe user agents. I believe this is fine because the GUM spec actually never puts any requirement on the user agent to pick what it should pick of the final candidates. So I believe user agents can follow the intent here and smooth out the edge cases. So perhaps for interop, basically the GUM spec does not dictate interop on downscaling either. So I think this is good.
That's strange.
Well, I had different versions where I did downscaling by 5 pixels at a time, 2 pixels at a time, 1 pixel at a time. And I think right now it does 1 pixel at a time because it just makes it slower, but it covers all the values. So, my suggestion is we don't say more than we already say in this PR about that.
That sounds like it's very good to be able to show what you're showing.
Any questions on that? I think that's the last slide. I have some more slides just for those are recap slides that I won't go over. Oh, there's also on recommendation from Harald, I'm not mentioning advanced constraints at all. As a vendor, I would like to not implement them for get display media, but it's also not a hardship.
So to me, this looks like reasonably well defined, and I believe that the spec will have fewer bugs with this pull request than without it. So my suggestion would be for the working group to say that we should merge this pull request and work on remaining bugs. If people are a bit dazed, I can understand that.
I mean, it's just clarifying existing stuff, right? Like listing the constraints, or is there something new here?
Well, what is new is that the spec without this PR doesn't say anything about how constraints apply to get display media and screen sharing.
Right. With the
so you could probably deduce how it should work, but it's better to write it down.
Yeah. Okay, I agree.
And there's one more slide on specifically about the Retina case, if there are questions on that. So basically, there was some discussion on the list if we could multiple ways to do this, so I might as well ask a question. And so basically, question was, what do width height constraints numbers, what unit are they in? And the answer is the size of the data in pixels. And the cue here is from how I looked at how Canvas Draw works on Retina, and the answer there was basically scale it down. So the proposal for screen capture in Retina is basically the same thing. Double it and scale down. So I'm showing the example that so the text we added what user agents should downscale by device pixel ratio by default. And I'm showing the JavaScript here you could do too if you wanted the full thing. And the good thing there is that we already have the resize mode constraint defined in GUM. And so there's no new API needed for this.
Hearing silence, I'm suggesting that we adopt these PRs and go on.
Is there a race here? You're getting capabilities and applying constraints while the user is resizing their window?
Well, that's covered by the text that says when that happens, the user agent should queue a task, which means that as far as JavaScript is concerned, the values won't change from under JavaScript. They might be, a millisecond behind. If the user is continually changing, you will get a value, and then next task you'll get a different value until you stop getting values, and at that point you will be caught up.
Yeah.
I would like to speak up in favor of merging this because the spec is currently in a confusing state. Not very long ago, there was almost no text about constraints. So it's important that we get something consistent in there as soon as possible.
Okay, I hear consensus. Let's go.
Great. So this is different issue 37. There was a request on GitHub to limit the browser sharing to a specific the whitelist or blacklist of domains or URLs. But let me read it. Please consider adding another constraint which will be relevant for browser. A commercial product may and will need to limit screen sharing to only those tabs which were open from a whitelist of domains or even URLs. And vice versa, it'll be very useful to support a blacklist of domains URLs, meaning never share content if a tab is navigated to this address. Unfortunately, this is a form of influencing user selection, which a malicious site may use to direct users to sharing a specific web surface under attacker control. So I vote we do not do this.
Well, what about the case where you have a website that just wants to share its tab? So you just say self, origin equals self.
Yes, unfortunately, that is the highest risk surface you could share, because that means an attacker could basically say the vulnerability with screen sharing that most people don't find obvious is that when you're sharing the attacker web surface and the attacker can itself see its own screen, they can then launch basically any URL in an iframe and thus circumvent the cross-origin protection, which means they could launch a bank URL where you're logged into, and then they could see the bits of data that they shouldn't be able to see. And I have more slides that basically I copied from somewhere else that goes into detail of this if there are more questions.
Basically, you're guiding towards not allowing tab share, mainly, I guess.
Well, I think what matters is that I don't think the spec disallows tab sharing, but the spec says that the JavaScript, the drive-by web cannot influence screen sharing beyond offering the user to screen share, and then which will bring up a selector that is under browser control that can then fully explain to the user what the risks of the different choices are. And it's always been considered harmful for to have a JavaScript surface that can narrow that choice beyond that.
Yep, but that seems good for us. I believe we will do something similar.
So close this bug with, no, we're not doing that, and here's why. Janiva to write.
Okay.
Yes.
Aggregate Windows.
Right. So the spec says that you can multiple monitors can be aggregated into a single logical monitor, and multiple windows can be aggregated into a single application surface. And again, this is just clarification because we never say what that means. And And I think we should say that, the relative window sizes must be maintained. So if you're sharing a small window and a large window, you shouldn't get any weird effect. And of course, I don't know if this is needed, but the area between windows, if you're sharing this window and this window, you must not leak other application data when you're sharing the total surface of that. And then I think it's an open question what to do when you have multiple windows and there's any space in between, or same with the resize, which was shown in the demo earlier. I suggest we say it should be filled in black, but I don't know if we want to say that the user agent has to maintain the position of the windows. Like if the user agent wants to show windows side by side, I think that's okay.
I think the user agent should be allowed to fill in purple.
Fill in purple.
Black is such an ugly color.
So who is implementing that? Who is using that? I would just question whether is it like something people actually want to have browsers support that? It's aggregated mode, or I'm questioning the use case. So maybe you can just remove it, and then we don't have to handle that.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's this distinction in the spec between window and application in a lot of places. But I think the distinction is actually confusing.
Yeah, application, well, Edge does not support application or aggregation.
I'm guessing the use case is, let's say you're sharing a Photoshop window and there's a lot of different windows that pop up that show. But I mean, if you want to share that, why aren't you just sharing a screen?
Yep.
It's actually even more simple.
Well, I would think that if we really want to, basically each window should be a track, and then you have a list of tracks, an array of tracks, and you send them, and you don't have to do black, you don't have to do anything. But I'm not sure it's useful to do that. So maybe you can keep things simple and not support it.
Well, Firefox does support application sharing, and I think it's useful in the programs that have multiple windows. And I think it would be good to keep that in the spec, because sharing the full screen, while it would have the same effect, has the full screen sharing has the heightened security risks because it could usually contains one browser service. So I think it's good. I think as far as the spec goes, the only thing observable difference here would be that there's a constraint name that would return, that a window would return application sometimes. That said, I think Firefox, we're shooting to downplay the application as an entity. If we're going to have a single list of all windows and all applications, that would be very confusing. So I think what we're thinking instead, that we're going to go with sharing windows. Maybe in the future we can make some exceptions, some small exceptions. Application has a lot. Maybe we can offer that as a combined sort of special surface for the user to pick, and then it would be a challenge for the prompt and the selector to communicate that to the user.
Yeah, my fear is that from a user perspective, it might be complex to understand what the browser is doing and what the browser is sharing. The screen is simple, a window is simple. An aggregation where there will be things that are black is less simple, and I'm not sure. As you say, if we downplay it, maybe it's good to not have it in the spec.
Right. My concern is that for some of these, I guess, maybe it's not that popular anymore to have windows with tons of toolbars, but I think end users often think of Photoshop, for instance, as a single window, including all those little things. So I think that's the reason to have it in here, would just be to cover that case. I mean, the alternative would be to call that a window as well. But then there are questions with applications like, what should you fill in? What color should you fill in? Should it be black or purple, and that kind of thing. So I don't think that the constraint does any harm either.
Yeah, but if a browser can select purple or one black, then why specifying things? Like a browser could say, oh, it's an application that I will share it as an aggregated window and nobody will know and everything is fine.
Well, I don't think the spec here demands that any browser has to implement application sharing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more of a question of whether we should have the constraint there. This is a readable only constraint. So we could leave it in there, in which case Firefox maybe someday you would get the value application back. Or if we don't have that, then probably you would get the value window back.
I'm not sure. Why does the application need to know what type of surface it is, right? From the application point of view, it's a part of a screen, and like that's all that any track ever is.
We could also remove the constraint.
Yep.
Yeah.
But it's been there for a long time.
I mean, I think there's a lot of room where the browser, the implementation can do whatever it wants. From the specs point of view, dealing with pixels. Right. If someone wants to implement, the only thing they implement is application, it's always aggregated. Or another implementation wants to do only window, and it's always Windows. Or if an implementation wants to do both with the selection, I don't see how it matters from application point of view. This seems more like a user making choices point of view.
Yeah, the only thing I've heard from developers, which this isn't useful for, is they wanted to know what content hint they should use, but I don't think this really gives any information. Shouldn't matter whether you do a display or an application or a window. That's not going to really help you determine the content hint. So as far as I can tell, it's fairly useless.
Well, it's been there in the spec for a long time. I think maybe we should ask on the list before we remove it outright, the other values it has.
I mean, the question is whether anybody implemented. We chose not to.
I think if you look at display capture surface type, there's monitor, window, application, and browser. I guess there's some value to an application to know, because we don't. I think the logic goes as follows: we're not allowing the JavaScript application any choice over constraining what the user ends up selecting. So it seems the least we could do is tell them what kind of thing the user selected.
But why does that matter?
Because it might, if you're sharing a window versus an application versus full screen, you might have different choices of I don't know, the size. Sure, but there are security risks. For instance, in the case of browser, maybe that's a reason for removing the constraint.
Yep.
Yeah, like I said, the only reasons I heard of were either inappropriate reasons or things that probably wouldn't work, such as the desire to figure out what content hint to use.
So I'm hearing that this is the simplest version is removing the constraints entirely, and second option is to remove the application value, because it doesn't seem to be clearly defined enough for to be useful.
And the third option will be to leave it alone.
Yes. So three choices. No constraint, no application. Leave as is. Anyone want to argue for taking one of these choices off the table? Silence. Anyone wants to argue that we should push this to the list and not try to make a call now?
I'm fine with going to the list. I would prefer in that case that we say, hey, the working group is planning to do that. If you do not hear any feedback, we'll do it.
Yep.
So that's an argument for trying to take a position now.
I think the user agent should be allowed to, let the user share whatever. If they want to aggregate, it's fine. If they don't, that's fine. But as of what we show to the JavaScript, I think it's just irrelevant. Just like we don't say which window they're sharing, it's just a track. We shouldn't say this is the type.
So just a quick straw poll to check if we can remove any of the options immediately. The 3 choices are remove the constraint, remove application, leave as is. Remove the constraint, raise your hand.
I'll also speak up for removing the constraint.
Remove application.
For both things, or?
Yeah, that's it. Remove application.
I will also speak up for removing application.
When you say remove application, are you saying just remove any language but let the user agent do whatever it wants, or are you saying that you're not allowed to aggregate?
Oh yes, I'm saying that remove the value application and remove any special mention of application. It's just Windows.
Okay.
And third one, keep as is.
I'm raising my hand only because I want to check with Martin Thompson first, since he added the original language.
Okay, and I think that was actually I'm trying to alleviate pushback against. Yeah. So at the moment, I think we got. We're going to take this to the list, but the 2 choices with some strongest support seems to be remove application or remove the constraint. Now, between remove application and remove constraint, which would you prefer?
So I guess I didn't vote for remove the constraint because I have a less clear model of what it implies, whereas I heard good arguments for removing application. But I might very easily be convinced that remove constraint.
So the other values of the constraint are?
The other values are monitor, window, application, and browser.
Okay, so removing the constraint would remove the ability for JavaScript to tell the difference between the other one. So raise your hand for. So the alternatives now are remove application and remove the whole constraint, and you're only allowed to vote or state your opinion of one of them. Remove the application. Please raise your hand. Remove the constraint.
I'll vote in favor of removing the constraint.
Okay, we will take to the list the option of the suggestion that we should remove the entire constraint. Thank you.
Okay, this is a bit of a recap from the virtual interim. With it's about the audio constraint. If you're sharing a video, like you're doing a presentation, you might also want to show like a video clip. It's a canonical use case where you might want audio. But, right, so initially I proposed like, let's make it very well defined. Just make it simple. Let's always give all the audio. But it's complicated because what audio sources are available is platform dependent and implementation dependent. Sometimes you might be able to share all audio. Sometimes you only have access to tabs audio. Sometimes you have a window. It's very unclear, and it's complicated to mix different audio sources. And so the conclusion was to say as little as possible about audio. And another thing to note is that audio it's something complementing the video sharing. It's not, it's not essential. It's not like a microphone. So the decision from the interim was to allow the audio constraint together with the video constraint, but it's up to the user agent which audio sources, if any, that entails, which means audio is ignorable. It's an optional thing to include.
So the thing would be that if audio is not there, there will never be any audio track. And if audio is true, there might be one.
So if if the user agent knows that there will not be any audio for the duration of the stream, then you will not return an audio track in the resulting stream. But you could return an audio track that's muted for some time and then it's unmuted, or it's up to the user agent. But this just says that if audio is available, there is an audio constraint, and you may get an audio track, but don't count on it.
So I'm a little confused about the slide here. On the top line, it says audio true, video true to allow sharing audio and video. That makes sense. And then it says proposal recap. It says audio true only.
Oh yeah, that was just lazy writing.
Okay.
So we did conclude that if you ask for audio but not video, you must reject the request. So it's always in complement to video.
Okay, so just to be clear then, because Get Display Media currently says that if you pass no arguments, you get video by default.
Yeah.
So we're saying that if you want video and audio, you have to specify both video true and audio true.
Yes.
Good.
If you want audio, you have to specify it, but you might not get it.
Right. I think this is important because what you're really, the whole spec is written around sharing display surfaces. And I don't think we want to change that focus. And that getting the audio out of a display surface is a nice bonus, but nothing more.
Yeah.
How does this work with the default being false?
So
No, it works for audio here, but not for video, does it?
What do you mean?
So if you say get display media nothing,
Then you get video, the same as video : true.
but that's consistent, right?
It's saying that the default is
And
to
in
get
particular,
video only.
dictionary, the default value is false. True.
Well, I mean, the dictionary is used here to carry information about options. And I think it's okay to say that this method by default, the default value is video true.
I'm pretty sure we'll get a from the tag.
anyway, that's a separate discussion. But yeah, that's a good point.
Well, we could remove the implicit value. I'd be okay with that.
Anyway, this is sort of recap. Does anyone want to object because the PR has not landed?
I would not object. At the same time, it's a new feature, and I'm sort of like on the edge of. So I guess Chrome will implement it or is implementing it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, should be simple enough, I guess. Hopefully, it's not adding any complexity, and the PR already.
Varun, I have a question, clarification. Is the audio nice or key names and things like that? But the audio track.
It goes out in the same connection at the RTP level, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, my only concern would be if audio was leaked from the system when the user selected a specific window, for example, and got audio from another window. That would be a concern.
there is responsibility by the user agent to make it clear to the user what they're sharing. I think it could be a valid use case to share more audio than just the particular window. But I can also see how you might not want to do that.
So then you would recommend to share audio only if you're sharing the screen, for instance?
So I think it's up to the, like, as long as the user understands what they're sharing, right? Like what is, like, I don't think any user has like a normal user would have a, like, oh, what's a different audio sources? They would just think sharing audio they would think of their own speakers. Like, yeah, I'm sharing my audio. They wouldn't think like, oh, which application is producing this audio? And
well, but it's an API to get a screen,
right,
which is clear from the user perspective. And now we're saying, oh, it will be audio.
If you share the full screen, I could see people expecting maybe audio from your system, or maybe they might not, the problem is they might not expect any audio. But if the user agent tells them, hey, you can also include the audio, great. If I share the full screen, I might be okay with having all system audio. If I only share like PowerPoint, I might not expect that other audio from my system would be shared.
Yeah, this could actually be a way of surveilling a PC and getting all audio out of it, even though the person just selected something, some small window or something. You end up, if it's used for telephony, you end up listening in on all the phone calls.
To be clear, the user agent has to tell the user what they're sharing, right? Like the whole point of making this audio thing optional is that you know, just like the application doesn't force the user which window they should share, they shouldn't force the user which audio to share. So it's a choice. It's a user choice.
Sure, but some feedback is saying that basically adding this feature will probably need guidelines or deep thoughts, right, in terms of security and so on. I don't know whether that has been made or not. So I'm not pushing against. Maybe it will be done later on, but still it will delay the whole spec as well, because this work will be needed if we include that feature in the spec.
So
right.
This is, of course, only the video capture and screen spec, not the video capture main spec.
So this spec does have a security section. I think at minimum it should mention something about not oversharing audio,
right?
And what the security risks might be with that, like correlating, like fingerprinting the user based on other tabs they might have open, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, definitely should have some section about that.
I note that we're closing in on the coffee break. Yeah. So I'm considering that we have a decision here to allow the PR as written, and note that we have to beef up the security section about sharing risk of sharing audio. Sounds good.
I just want to follow up. I'm assuming that we would want to have the audio constraints that we're used to having then? Echo cancellation, noise suppression, and auto gain control? Or no?
No.
No?
Let's make it simple this time around.
Right. The coffee break or next slide? The next slide will be a headache. It's a follow-up on this slide.
Let's, but I think that definitely not. Let's make a coffee break until 10:30. I need coffee for this. Okay. See you at 10:30. Yes.
Now you're talking about WebRTC, right? Yes.
Yeah, so when you do that, you always have,